Thank you very much, Deborah. And I thank Deborah. I thank St. Stephen's for hosting this event tonight. And I thank Don McCauley for doing all the technical stuff in the background. So I'm pleased to be here to talk about simple ways to protect your home from climate-driven flood risk. Or in other words, when things go wrong along the lines of that which you see depicted in these slides along the top row, flooding at the level of the community, and ultimately that water infiltrating down into basements, what actions can we take today to make it such that we don't see these types of events happening? So there's a very practical focus to our dissertation here this evening. And although we're talking about climate change induced risk, in the lower right-hand corner, another factor that also contributes to flood risk that I'll flag a little while later, but just as a reminder to me, it's not just the fact that as a result of climate change that we're experiencing storms that are bigger today and more water coming down over shorter periods of time, and that's driving flood risk. We've also, for example, in Southern Ontario, over the course of the last 100 years or so, lost about 72 to 73% of the natural infrastructure that was originally here, the forests, the fields and wetlands that offered a place for water to go when the storms hit and store there safely and discharge slowly downstream or into the groundwater system. Over the last 100 years, we've removed about 72, 73% of that natural infrastructure from the landscape. We've either paved it over or turned it into agricultural development. And when the big storms hit, the water tends to not stay on that landscape very long and runs off quickly, potentially into someone's basement, causing flooding. And that also contributes to the problem. But overall, we're going to focus on home flood risk protection, which ultimately will help protect homeowners and or those who perhaps rent and live in basements. So if we could have the next slide, please. By way of agenda, just to drill down a little bit, I'm going to start by painting the picture of the formidability of the challenge we face. And that is, first of all, to point out that climate change is real. Climate change has happened, is happening, and will continue to happen. And it's also effectively irreversible. In other words, climate change is here to stay. We can and should do everything within our power to slow down the rate of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But we also have to recognize that, by the way, this ship is not going to turn around. The formidability of extreme weather risk is going to be more challenging going forward. So I really want to paint that picture. And then we'll turn to what are some of the costs associated with climate change and extreme weather events that are being realized in the country. And the best way to depict those costs quantitatively is to focus on the escalating catastrophic loss insurable claims being realized in the country. And the primary driver driving the escalation in the costs is too much water in the wrong place, flooding. Flooding is the #1 challenge in Canada due to climate change by far, and particularly residential basement flooding, hence the focus of tonight's talk. Now, when I go through points 1 and 2, and I can kind of warn you now, it's not going to put you in a good mood. The first part where we're describing the challenge and so forth, it's not very pleasant. But things start to turn around a little bit when we talk about, well, what can we do to mitigate the costs associated with flooding and residential basement flooding? And that's, and Canada we haven't just been sitting on our hands in Canada relative to climate risk. We've developed practical, meaningful, cost-effective ways to mitigate risk, and that's really what we're going to focus in on. And then at the end, we'll entertain any questions you might have. So let's start with the first point first, that climate change is real and effectively irreversible. And if we could have the next slide, please. When I talk about the fact that climate change is real and effectively irreversible, this is not my cavalier opinion. This is the opinion shared by many people in the scientific community, starting as far back and even earlier than this. But in this case, on the top part of the slide, the report you see was a report authored by something called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In 2014, this report came out, and it was authored by several hundred climate scientists from around the world who do nothing else 7 days a week other than study climate science. And in that report, they've they stated, and it's in italics here to the right, and it's in italics because I've taken the statement directly from the report. They say, and so I'll read it and then give a little context to the statement. They say it is extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. And what the human influence they're referring to here is the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. The burning of those fossil fuels that when they're burnt, they release CO2, carbon dioxide, which builds up into the atmosphere. And it effectively, as it builds up in the atmosphere, functions as a blanket, if you will, or an envelope around the Earth that traps heat that otherwise would escape into space. It stays in the system, it causes warming, and as a result in warming, we see a change in the dynamic of the weather system. And amongst other points, for example, warmer air holds more moisture. So when we experience big storms going forward, the energy that's stored in this system that otherwise may have escaped into space, it's still there, it didn't disappear. So when storms occur, we may have storms with greater ferocity attached to them, and with warmer air, we have more water coming down over shorter periods of time, and therein lies the challenge. And by the way, sometimes people will ask, will say, well, in the geological history of the Earth, hasn't climate change occurred many times? And the answer is yes. There's lots of things that affect climate change in the history of the planet over 4.6 or 7 billion years. Changes in the Earth's movement and wobble on its axes, changes in solar irradiance, volcanic activity. There's a variety of things that can affect climate change on a geological timescale. But in the short term of the last 100 to 120 years, the only factor that explains the observed climate change that we've realized is the burning of fossil fuels, period. That's the causal mechanism. And over the period of the last 120 years, the Earth has increased in temperature by about 1.2 degrees Celsius. We're 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer today, on average, around the planet than was the case a little over 100 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution, before we started burning fossil fuels. Now, at first, when you hear that we're up 1.2 degrees Celsius, it doesn't really sound like a big deal. As a matter of fact, it wasn't that long ago, I was explaining this to our next door neighbor, and I said to her, you know, we're 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer today on the planet than we were 100 years ago. And she said, well, that sounds nice. Not realizing that the difference in temperature on the planet today versus an ice age is about 5 or 6 degrees Celsius, depending on where you set the stop and start dates. So when you consider the fact that the difference between the temperature we have on the planet today versus an ice age is about 5 or 6 degrees Celsius, being up 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer today than we were 100 years ago, that's a pretty big deal. And then more recently, on the bottom half of the slide, there's a report in the lower left-hand corner called Canada's Changing Climate Report 2019. And this was authored by about more or less 10 climate scientists from Environment Canada, where in that report, they made this statement. And this is the first time this statement was made publicly and with government scientists in Canada in this case. They said, Canada's climate has warmed and will warm further in the future, driven by human influence, i.e. the burning of fossil fuels. This warming is effectively irreversible. And it's this point that I'm really driving home, that given the fact that climate change is here to stay, and we're doing everything within our power to slow down that rate of change, we still are going to get more extreme weather. We are experiencing more extreme weather on the ground today, and we're going to get more extreme weather going forward. So we really need to learn to adapt to this extreme weather risk. And tonight we're going to focus on the individual house and how we can adapt to increasing flood risk. And for Canada, prior to this report coming out just 2 years ago or so, probably 97% of the discussion in the country on climate change with politicians and everybody who studies the subject, 98% of the discussion was on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and are we going to have a cap and trade system or a carbon tax and so forth. And all the direction was towards mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, which is a good thing to do, but very little attention focused on adapting to the extreme weather risk that's on the ground today. And by the way, although we're focusing on flooding, there are a lot of things going wrong, depending on where you are. We can have flood, drought, fire, hail, wind, snow load, permafrost loss, sea level rise. Lots of things are going wrong tonight we're going to zero in on just one dimension of those things that are challenging, and that is the flood risk. So that's where we're heading. Now let me, next slide please, document the increasing costs associated with climate change. So what you're looking at here on this slide, just to give a little bit of context, along the x-axis or the base, you're looking at time from 1983 up to 2020. And on the left-hand side, the y-axis, you're looking at billions of dollars paid out. This chart documents the amount of money paid out by way of each one of these bars in catastrophic loss insurable claims in any given year. And in an insurance language, a catastrophic event is any event like a flood or a fire or a hailstorm or a windstorm. If it triggers more than $25 million in claims, that's called a catastrophic event. And there's organizations in the country, the Insurance Bureau of Canada and others, that add up these numbers on an annual basis, and they plot them out as you see here. And by the way, all this data, you can see the upward bend of the curve, all of this data has been corrected for inflation and for per capita wealth accumulation. In other words, if you were insuring twice as many homes today as you were 10 years ago, you would think, well, the insurance claims would be twice as high. So those factors have been factored out of this data to make it such that horizontally, we're looking at a comparison of apples to apples. So having said that, what you can see is that from about 1983 up to 2008 in Canada, and by the way, here I'm still painting the picture of the challenge of climate change and why we want to get on board to protecting our homes. From 1983 up to 2008, the insurance industry could count on, in this country, paying out between about $250 to $450 million per year in insurance claims. But everything started to change on or about 2009, whereby going forward, from 2009 to the present, for 11 out of the last 12 years, the catastrophic loss claims have gone over $1 billion per year, every year for 11 out of the last 12 years, for an average cost of about $1.8 to $1.9 billion per year. And the culprit that explains most of the upward bend in this curve is too much water in the wrong place, flooding. Flooding explains about 60% of the upward bend in the curve, and in particular, residential basement flooding. And if you look in the upper left-hand corner of the slide there a little bit in red, you'll see just a few documented points here. Right now for the country, the average cost of a flooded basement in Canada is $43,000. Climate-induced flooded basement. In other words, water flowing in through the side window of your house during a big storm or up through the sewer drain. I don't mean if the dishwasher overflowed or something like that. So climate-induced basement flooding cost on average about $43,000 across the country. We've had, as a result of the elevating claims, annual home insurance premiums have increased by 20 to 25% over the last 5 years, 60% of that increase due to flooding. There's an increase in the percentage of homes across the country literally from Halifax to Victoria that are now uninsurable, where people, when their insurance comes up for renewal, they find themselves in a position they may not be able to get insurance coverage for their homes relative to basement flooding. They can still get it for theft and fire, but because they live in areas that the risk associated with basement flooding is so high that the premium that the insurers would have to charge would be off the charts and nobody could afford it. So, and by the way, there are pockets in Mississauga, there are pockets in Toronto, in Kingston, in Windsor, and then New Glasgow, Nova Scotia to cities out west where this phenomenon is occurring. As a matter of fact, pretty much every spring when the floods start to hit across the country, I get calls almost predictably from mayors and councillors across the country to say, what can I do? My constituents are in a position whereby they can't, when their insurance comes up for renewal, they can't get it. We've also, our group, the research group I'm associated with at the Intech Center at the University of Waterloo, we're going to be releasing a report very, very shortly where we've examined the effect of catastrophic flooding in communities for the types of events you see on the news at night when flooding is occurring. We have found that when major flood events occur, that there's a hit on home price, on the sale price of homes, in the order of about a 3 to 9% reduction in home value if you compare 6 months before a flood versus 6 months after. So this stuff, all of everything I'm saying here is really painting the picture again. And remember, I said at the beginning, this is going to put you in a good mood. The formidability of the challenge. So we have to figure out how do we adapt to this type of risk to not have the problems that are driving the phenomena you see on this diagram. And the next slide, please. So now things start to get a little bit better. That's all the bad news. Now the good news is, what are we doing about all this? Well, in Canada, as I mentioned earlier, we haven't just been sitting on our hands. We've been figuring out ways to mitigate flood risk in the country at a variety of levels. And we're only going to focus on one of these, but I just thought I'd point out a little bit of good news here. If you go to the upper left-hand corner, you will see a report there that says home below it. That's a document that was developed in Canada by supported by the National Research Council, the Standards Council of Canada, Canadian Standards Association that you're all familiar with, that certify hockey helmets to toasters. Our group, the Intact Center, deeply involved in the formulation of this document, and indeed about 80 organizations across the country. In this document, we identify means to help protect homes from basement flooding, and that's the one we're going to zero in on tonight. But just to let you know, if we move counterclockwise, some of these other reports that we're not going to go into, but I'll just mention them to you so you know they're there. We've also developed very good guidance for the country, practical, meaningful, cost-effective guidance that focuses on flood risk mitigation for new community design. How do we build new communities going forward such that when the big storms hit, everybody isn't flooded out? And by the way, that starts with don't build on a floodplain. The next report over, the second one from the left on the bottom, that focuses on flood risk mitigation for existing communities. What can we do in existing communities so that when the big storms hit, we're not running out at the last minute trying to put out hundreds of thousands of sandbags to hold water back or direct it to safe locations. So that's well worked out. Ahead of the storm is guidance for commercial real estate, for condo towers and business towers. What can we do to make it such that their underground basement parking lots don't flood out? Lower right-hand corner is a lot of work that's been done on retaining and restoring natural infrastructure across the country to give water a place to go when the big storms hit, to mitigate flood risk. And also, by the way, support biodiversity and sequester carbon and limit pollution prevention and support aesthetics in communities. In other words, natural infrastructure looks nicer than looking at a brick wall or parking lot somewhere. We're about to release in about 2 months from now or something like that, a new report and guidance for Canada on flood risk mitigation to a coastline resiliency standard to mitigate risks associated with sea level rise, storm surge, and king tides. And that's for Canada's east and west coast. And by the way, that only leaves one area now left for the country where we need guidance, and that'll be developed in about 2 years, a shoreline resiliency standard for the Great Lakes. And the key findings of these reports, by the way, the key messaging has been brought under one report called Under One Umbrella. From all of these reports, what's the core messaging that really needs to be addressed for the country? And I spent a great deal of my time with federal, provincial, municipal governments, ministers, deputy ministers, mayors, councillors, whatever. And when they want guidance on flood risk protection, or city managers, whoever it might be, you can turn to one document that consolidates the findings in an easily understood fashion. Now, having said that, I want to zero in on the home, the thing that we're here to talk about tonight. And the report in the upper left-hand corner, one of the activities that we engaged as a research organization was we went into several hundred homes, about 700 or 800 homes across Canada from various provinces, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario, and further west. And we spent about 2 hours per home documenting things that could be wrong around the outside of the property and in the basement itself that could affect flood risk. And I just want to show you a few of these findings. If we could have the next slide, please. And so what you're looking at here in the green, the blue, and the yellow are some of the characteristics associated with flood risk at the level of the individual home. And what we found, I won't go through all these, but just to illustrate that, by the way, solutions to the problem that we're then going to turn to are, this isn't the physics of curved space. This is pretty straightforward stuff. What we found if you look at the green bars at the top, is that for 78% of the homes we examined, where the pipe comes down the side wall of the house from the east trough and drains water down and hopefully flows away at ground level. 78% of the time, that water was discharging right at the base of the house. It wasn't being directed a couple of meters away from the house and not towards your neighbor's house, but discharging right at the base of the house, at the wall of the house. That water will percolate down the wall into the weeping tile system and very often end up back in someone's basement. And that was 78% of the time. We found on the second green bar down, 70% of the time, or 69%, close enough to 70, that for 70% of the homes we examined, there was somewhere around the house where the actual grading around the property directed water towards the house versus away from the house, believe it or not. In the blue bars, no backup on the top line for the blue bars, no backup power for our sub pump. There's very often in people's basements, there will be what looks like a bucket below the basement floor, that if water came into the basement, it would flow into that bucket. There would be a little motor or pump in there called a sub pump to pump the water outside. But the time you need that system to work is when the big storms are hitting. That's when the water's coming, and that's when you really depend on this system. But very often when the big storms hit, the power goes out. So if you don't have battery backup supply for your sub pump to run it for 1, 2, 3 days, perhaps if there's electricity outage, the time you need it, it's not going to be there. So and 84% of homes that have sub pumps don't have a battery backup supply, which is a simple $200 kit. That could be problematic for them. And then if we look down towards the one that says, in blue bar, it says 35%. And by the way, this one has nothing to do with climate change. This is just plain craziness. The 35% of homes we went into had the little drain that's in the basement that's there, that if your washing machine overflowed or your dishwasher overflowed and water was in the basement to drain away, 35% of homes have that drain covered up. They have it tiled over or otherwise blocked such that if water got into the basement, it would have nowhere to go. So that's just a matter of keeping it clear. And then finally, and this is the last one I'll mention on this page, no maintenance of backwater valve. I'll show you this a little while later, but basically for the drain in the basement that we just described, you can put a valve on that drain line in the basement that if water were to come in the basement, it can drain outside. It's safely away. But during really big storms, water can sometimes surge up through that system and flood into your basement. So you can put a little valve on that system that has a trap door that allows water to go out of the basement, but not into the basement. But if you don't clean that valve, it's called the backwater valve, twice a year for about 5 or 10 minutes with just a simple toilet brush, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, so very exciting. That valve will not seal properly about 85% of the time. So a lot of people that think, well, I've got a backwater valve, I'm safe. If you don't maintain it, it will probably not seal, and you'll end up with a flooded basement, and really your backwater valve is little more than a decoration in the basement. So the point in this examination was to just document how many things are typically wrong around houses, and then how do we correct them. So if we could have the next slide, please. So one of the things we have done as an organization, and by the way, all these slides and then this particular graphic are available to everybody. One of the things we've done, we developed something called our 3 steps to cost-effective home flood protection infographic. This sheet of paper you see on the right-hand side here. And there are 15 boxes on this sheet, and I'm going to describe them in the following few slides. But along the top row, what it amounts to are 5 things that you can do around your house as simple, basic maintenance for no dollars, just a little bit of elbow grease, and even then it's next to nothing. That can be the difference between having a $43,000 basement flood versus not. So these are things you can do for nothing, and I'm going to describe them in the next few slides, so I won't go into them here. Then under step 2, we have things that you can do around your house, generally speaking, over a long weekend with no special expertise really for all of these things, for less than $250. And then on the bottom row, we have actions that you can take around the house for just a little bit more than $250, but not much, barring one item that I'll describe, for a few $100s that can again contribute to you not having a flooded basement. And this particular infographic has turned out to be so popular, it's now being, for example, mailed out in various cities across the country with people's property tax notices, i.e. mail that you have to open. You can't dismiss it as junk mail. This infographic is, for a multitude of cities across the country now, is being added, this single sheet of paper, to say, by the way, look at these things around your house so you don't end up with a flooded basement. The insurers are distributing this material. One of the major banks that I won't name, but the initials rhyme with BMO, they're distributing this infographic to about 200,000 of their mortgage customers and clients to give them direction on protecting their homes from basement flooding, and the list goes on and on. So I'm just going to now describe some of the aspects of the information presented on this infographic as actions that you may take around your own home or it could be your kid's home or whoever, to not end up with a flooded basement. So if we could have the next slide, please. So this is from the top row. These are the things that you can do around the home for free, and you'll be shocked at how simple some of these things are. Starting with, for example, on the left-hand side of the slide, it shows a person with a broom or a rake removing leaves from a sewer grate out front of a home. This is something that people should do aggressively and with vigilance to make sure that sewer grates, particularly in the fall, particularly in the fall, when the leaves are very often piled up at the boulevard, but a little bit of wind comes along, blows them over a sewer grate, and then a big storm comes along and causes flooding because water can't get down through the sewer. Or similarly in the spring, if leaves are blocking up the sewer grate from the winter, that should be cleared to allow water to drain if a big storm hits. And for example, just to show you that this stuff is real, about 2.5 years ago in Guelph, in the fall, there was a major storm occurred where about 80 millimeters of rain came down over about a 5-hour period. Leaves were on the ground on the boulevard, causing blockage of sewer grates. Nobody had cleared them. And that resulted in about $30 million of flooded basements, water that flowed overland through side windows of houses and into the basements. And really, for the equivalent of somebody going out with a rake or a broom and so forth, a big chunk of that $30 million could have been saved. Around your house, you should make sure your east trough that you keep it clear of leaves and other forms of debris building up and preventing water from safely flowing down the wall and away from the house. You don't want the water over coursing the east trough and just dropping down the wall of your house and ultimately ending up in your basement. The third one over is just people, this is not really a climate change thing, but people very often just don't periodically check their plumbing to make sure that the plumbing itself doesn't leak. So that's sort of a climate change freebie. The testing your sub pump, and this one I'm going to describe on the next slide, and cleaning out the backwater valve. So next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, you can have a situation, as you see on the right-hand side of the slide here, whereby below the circular area in the lower right-hand corner, there's basically a bucket, and there's a pump in the bottom of that bucket that if water comes into the basement, the pump turns on and pumps water outside up through that pump and hopefully away from the house. But very often, if you don't, but you have to check that sub pump because it may run very infrequently, i.e. water doesn't build up in the sump well, but during a big storm it might. You should check it to make sure it works. Because very often what happens, the first time people find out that their sub pump is seized and doesn't function is when they have 3 feet of sewer water in their basement, which is not the check you want. But it's very simple just to take a bucket of water, pour it into the sump well, see does the sub pump turn on and pump water outside, and if it does, you're in good shape. And if not, you're well advised to go spend $100 to get a new sub pump rather than realize a basement flood event. Next slide, please. Here we talked about the backwater valve. Remember I said the little valve on the drain in the basement that allows water to flow out of the basement properly. But particularly if you have an older house where the storm and the sanitary sewer lines may be linked on the same system, during really big storms, water can back up through that line and ultimately up into your basement. Well, if you have a little backwater valve like this stops water from coming into your basement through a trap door that seals. But if you don't do as being done in the right-hand side of the slide, if you don't take a brush and clean that trap door so that it seals properly in the spring and the fall, which not a terribly glamorous job, but nonetheless necessary. That can be the difference between having a flooded basement versus not. And it's at first glance, people say to me, "Oh, I don't really want to do that. You know, it's kind of a dirty job and so forth." Well, believe me, compared to having 3 feet of sewer water in your basement, this is a pretty good alternative. Next slide, please. So here we have actions you can take around the house. Again, all of this can be done over the coming weekend, but not on Sunday, because then you're off to hear Deborah. But otherwise, you can do the following. You can install plastic covers over window wells to make it such that when the big storms hit, the water doesn't fill the window well and subsequently flow into your basement. And these are more or less $40 a piece at Home Depot or wherever you might be, wherever you might shop. Easily applied, not difficult to apply. They're safe. They make it such that light can come in, and or if during a fire you had to escape through a window outside, these things will just push out of the way, but they will keep water from building up in the window well during a big storm. You want to make sure that the downspouts around your house are draining water well away from your house, not just discharging water at the base. The third box over focuses on storing valuables and hazardous materials in watertight containers and securing fuel tanks. Now, for those of you who might have a fuel tank, and it's probably not too many on this call, but if you lived in the country, many people do. You don't want water flooding the basement and turning that oil tank over. But storing items in the basement up out of harm's way in plastic boxes if flooding were to occur, this is enormously important. And at first glance, this doesn't sound like a big deal. But I remember, some of you will remember a few years ago, Anna Maria Tremonti, who used to host a show on CBC Radio, and we used to do lots of interviews together. We actually we took Anna Maria to out in the field one morning for her radio show and took her to a house that had experienced basement flooding. And this lady was walking through the house and through the basement where flooding had occurred. And she came to a section of a box of her personal mementos. These are your wedding albums, your kids' pictures in school. And in this case also, she had a little doll that had been, this lady was in her 50s, and she had a little doll that was given to her by her father 50 years prior to. Well, this thing was basically just buried in basement flooded material and gunk, not very nice stuff. And this is, and she started to cry on the air, which actually, quite frankly, not to sound indelicate, it created a great radio show, but I sure felt sorry for this poor lady. And it is amazing when people when its personal mementos are lost, that's what really gets to people. It sounds like the light part of the equation, but quite frankly, it's the stuff you can't replace that people zero in on. One box over, keeping the drain in the basement open and a flood alarm. So I'll say something about both on the next slides. If we could advance, please. So here again, make sure that if you have boxes or whatever stored in the basement or tiling or whatever, that you do not cover that drain. That drain has to be open and clear. And 33%, 1/3 of homes in Canada right now, as of this moment, and Deborah, you're sitting in Mississauga, 1/3 of homes right now in Mississauga have that drain covered over. And if their dishwasher overflowed tonight, forget climate change, if their dishwasher overflowed, the water would fill the basement if they didn't get it beforehand. Next slide, please. Also, what you can do for a very small amount of money, you can buy a flood alarm. And it's a little sensor that sits on the floor in the basement or around areas that, even if you have machinery that might leak, that the moment it detects water, it sends a signal off in terms of an actual alarm. Or in our case, in our particular home, we actually have it hooked up to my cell phone that I could be anywhere. And if water entered our basement, hit the basement floor, I would get a notice instantly that water's in the basement, go home, go fix the problem. And you can purchase this pretty much anywhere, and it's very, very inexpensive, $100 to $200. Next slide, please. And on this row, we look at a few actions around the house that are perhaps a little bit more expensive, but not unduly so. and perhaps might require a little bit more expertise than correcting some of the previous measures, but not anything that any handy person couldn't do. If you have window wells around your house at grade level, you want to make sure that the framing around the window well extends about 10 to 15 centimeters above grade level, such that if water gathered around the window well, it gets stopped. It doesn't actually enter into the window well because you're far enough above grade that the water is held back. Disconnecting downspouts from the eaves trough system, you want to cut those off and put an extension on the pipe to direct water safely away from the home. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. You want to make sure that the grading around your house is such that water is flowing away from the house, not towards it. And quite frankly, the easiest way to check this is maybe not during a catastrophic flood, but during a fairly major rain event. Just walk around the house with an umbrella and see, is water pooling anywhere in around the house? And if it is, these are the areas that have to be filled in to direct water away. You may want to install a backwater valve, particularly if you have a house that's 10 or 15 years old and or older. And very often it could be that the storm and sanitary sewer lines of those older homes are connected. And if a big storm hit, water can back up through the sewer system into your basement, as I described earlier. For most major cities, and I'm almost positive this is the case for Mississauga, Toronto, Burlington, and others, generally speaking, they offer about a 70% subsidy to have one of these things installed. The backwater valve installed is for an existing home is about $2,800, but generally speaking, you get about 70% of that cost covered by the city. And then finally, on the right-hand side, you want to have a battery backup supply to run the sub pump in the event a storm occurs and the power goes out. And I'll describe one or two of these a little bit more in the next slide, please. So here is a simple diagram simply saying that if the downspout that comes from your eaves trough system, if that disappears into the ground, into the weeping tile system, you could just cut that off, put an elbow on it, cap the area that you cut off, and direct water to a swale or some other safe source for discharge, and not towards your neighbor's home, unless you don't like your neighbor. Direct that water to a safe location. And indeed, when I was younger, and I lived in a basement apartment when I was doing some degree, the basement flooded. And I thought, well, maybe that's just a one-off. But then it happened again during another major storm. And I said to the owner of the home where I was renting the basement, I said, you know, I'm pretty sure I know what's wrong. And it's that the water is coming down from the eaves trough system into the weeping tile system. If we just cut that off, put an elbow on it, and direct the water away from the home, I think we'll be problem free. And I said, and by the way, I'll pay the $40 to have this done because I don't want to get up in the morning and have water in the basement. And sure enough, we did it. And that's the last time he ever saw water in his basement. So that took about 15 minutes to solve. Next slide, please. Again, as I mentioned, pretty much anywhere you can go, and this is not, these actually come in kits. You can go to a Canadian Tire, a Home Depot, or anywhere along those lines and buy a kit with a battery for about $200, $250 and actually install a battery backup supply associated with your sub pump to run the sub pump when the big storms hit if the electricity goes out. And by the way, for almost everything that I've mentioned here, or combination thereof, with your insurance company, if you install one or various of these items, and it depends on your particular insurance provider, you'll receive about a 5 to 15% reduction on your insurance premium as a little bit of an incentive. But quite frankly, in my opinion, the bigger incentive is not having a flooded basement. You think about the fact that somebody spends 20, 30 years of their life paying for a home, generally speaking, their biggest investment in life and their retirement plan, but they put more effort into planning their vacation than they do into protecting their home from basement flooding. These are all pretty good things to do. It's a good use of time. Next slide, please. And then for any of you who wish to, and this is very, very simple to do, if you go to our website, the Intact Center on Climate, and by the way, I get no money out of this. This is not a commercial. The only thing I'm selling here is ideas. That's it. But if you go to our website, the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation, you just type Intact Center and it'll come up instantly. On our website, it's very easy. If you click a couple of buttons, just follow the guides. you can download a simple app that looks like what you see on the right-hand side of the slide, that it will ask you about, you can do this in about 5 or 10 minutes. It will ask you a series of, I think it's 15 questions that all can be answered yes or no. And it will be questions like, have you disconnected the downspout? Have you checked your sub pump with a bucket of water to make sure it works? Do you have plastic covers over window wells? Yes or no, to a whole series of questions that anybody can answer. And that takes you about 5 or 10 minutes to fill out. You hit send, and you will get a report 5 minutes later in your email documenting these are the things you're doing right around your house, and here are 6 or 8 things that you need to improve to lower the chances of having a flooded basement by addressing the factors that along the lines of that which we've just described. So anybody can do this. Next slide, please. And then finally, just a few points, and I won't go through all these statistics, but what they really amount to is that very often people engage in management by disaster. They kind of almost wait till they have a flooded basement and then get really interested in getting their insurance provider or broker on the phone to say, I've got a flooded basement, what am I covered for, what am I not covered for, etc. Find all this stuff out ahead of time. If water flows through, for example, if it comes up through the drain in your basement, that's creatively called in insurance terms, sewer backup flooding. Are you covered for that? That's a special coverage for basement flooding. If water flows through the side window of your house and comes down the wall and floods into the basement during a big storm, that's called overland flooding. That's a different insurance provision that you can purchase or not. And these are all very inexpensive. But don't wait until you have disaster striking to find out what you're covered for by way of insurance. That's the point. So all of this sums up in the following point, is that with climate change, for sure, this stuff is going to get more challenging going forward, guaranteed. The intensity, by the way, of the major storms, the top 1% of major storms that occur around the western end of the Great Lakes, that the intensity of those top 1% of storms has increased by 37% over the last 70 years. Towards the eastern end of the Great Lakes, the intensity of those big storms that occur has increased by 71% over the last 70 years. So some of you who are a little bit older and have all the gray hair that I have, if you have the perception that it seems like the big storms that occur today, there's more rain coming down over shorter periods of time than was the case then when I was a kid, your perception is actually borne out in fact. That is a reality. So let's not wait for disasters to strike. Let's be proactive, and let's self-examine our homes to put the types of measures I've talked about in terms of application. Let's bring them into play sooner than later. So I thank you very much for your attention.
Blair, thank you very much. And we already do have a couple of questions, and if anyone else has questions and you'd like to put them in the chat, but we only have 2 in the chat at the moment, so it could be that we can just open up to everyone else. So the first question is from Rita, and sorry, I have to minimize my screen for a moment. Blair, Rita says, it sounds like a lot of work has been done on adaptability, but Canada has yet to meet any climate change targets regardless of party in power. So we are going to have to keep adapting. Any suggestions on how to get them to act so that we don't have to continually find new ways to adapt, especially since Canada is warming faster than any other country?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it's one I spend a great deal of time on. And I can tell you right now that the biggest challenge we have on the climate file in the country at the moment is complacency and or lack of sense of appreciation for the urgency of the need to act to both mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to extreme weather risk. So I'm hoping more and more the degree to which we present material like you've just seen, or other expressions of extreme weather risk being highly problematic, that it will motivate governments at all levels and industry associations and other, and just the common everyday person to work to get the risk out of the system as can be realized by increasing the efficiency of operations of buildings and fuel usage for vehicles and other areas of that depend on coal, oil, and natural gas to burn to to create energy. We need to get off coal, oil, and natural gas and have energy sources that are greenhouse gas free of emissions. And we need to do that rapidly. And though we need to adapt to the extreme weather risk. And my biggest struggle every single day is not knowing what to do. In many, many regards, we know what to do. The issue is that we're not applying that which we know to do nearly fast enough. That's the big challenge for the country.
Blair, thank you. And the next question from Larry Leckie. Is there a way to prevent an in-ground septic system from overflowing during a major rain event?
To tell you the truth, I'm just simply not an expert on that area. And I mean, quite frankly, it's making sure that you anticipate the major event and try and keep, freeboard or space in the septic system available. So if a major storm event occurs, its water's got a place to store. So other than being proactive in trying to ensure that you've got more space for added volume in short periods of time in the septic system, I don't think there's that much more you can do. But then again, I'm not an expert on septic systems.
There, thank you. From Moira, are these great solutions shared with, example, townhouse condo corporations?
Yes, but not to the extent they should be. We are, and we certainly try, but it probably most of the emphasis that thus far has been on the individual detached homes, semi-detached homes, and sometimes row housing. But I think we could do a better job on the row housing or condo corporations in communicating this information than we have to date.
There, thank you. And from Karen, how do we know if we need a sump pump and don't currently have one?
One of the things you can do, assuming she's in Ontario, is check.
Yeah, she's not far away.
Yeah, if you check with the Conservation Authority or even in this, if it's the town of Mississauga, you can check with the local Credit Valley Conservation Authority would be my first stop, and tell them this is where I live. And the Credit Valley Conservation Authority, if it's Mississauga, they can tell you very quickly, are you in a high, medium, or low area for potential flood risk? And they'll give you pretty good guidance on whether or not it would be useful to install a sub pump, yes or no. And then in part, it's also going to be dependent on the age of the home. If you have a home that's 10 years or newer, chances are you have separation of the storm and sanitary sewer lines. So that works in your favor to potentially not need a sub pump. And but my first stop would be with the Credit Valley Conservation Authority, and they'd be happy to help.
Claire, thank you. From Claire, could the new Energy Advisor program that is coming out include this kind of assessment of properties?
Yes. Could it or will it? There's two different. So should it? The answer is yes. And by the way, for Canada's EnerGuide program, and I'm quite involved in this with Natural Resources Canada, with Canada's EnerGuide program, it gives direction to homeowners on how to make their home more energy efficient. The more insulation in the attics and better sealed windows, and various actions, door seals, etc. High efficiency furnaces, that kind of thing. Things that can make the house itself more energy efficient. But my very strong recommendation to government, and actually this is also being developed with CMHC, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. We're looking at having the same individual who would come to a house to examine it from the perspective of energy efficiency and make recommendations for improvement, and even offer subsidies through government to have those items put in place. We want that same person trained to do visual inspections of the outside of the property and the basement itself for flood risk that can affect basement flooding, and have that expertise all in one person, one-stop shopping for a delivery of both energy efficiency and home flood protection in one individual. So that's where we're heading, but I still think I think about a year away from that, or for that to actually happen.
Thank you. A longer question from Rita. We are interested in moving, and as we consider where to purchase a home, I was told that anyone can call their insurance company, provide the postal code of the home we're interested in purchasing, and that my insurance company should be able to find out whether that home area has suffered from flooding in the past. One, is that true? And I've also been told that flood maps are not up to date and that insurance companies are reluctant to share the mapping they may have developed. Where can we access up-to-date reliable data on flood zones?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the last part first. So Rita, I think it was, is
Yeah.
quite correct. The flood risk maps for Canada, on average, are about 20 to 30 years out of date. So one of the big focus areas for the country right now is to bring the flood risk maps up to date for the risk that's on the ground today, period. And then in anticipation of the risk that's coming in the future. So this is an area of active engagement between the Insurance Bureau of Canada, Public Safety Canada, and other government entities to bring the flood risk maps up to date. I still don't think they'll be brought up to date for probably minimally and then made publicly available another 5 years or so. Now, in reference to contacting the insurers and them disclosing risk for someone potentially buying a house somewhere, there's about 160, 170, something like that, property and casualty insurance companies in Canada. So I can't speak for all of them, but certainly for the larger ones, the above my head, Intact Financial, Intact Insurance, Desjardins, Cooperators, Aviva, the larger insurers, I think she would find that they'd be quite receptive to disclosing whether or not a particular area you might buy a house would be problematic relative to flood insurance.
And then did you answer the first part too? Was that part of it?
Yeah,
yes,
well,
yeah, thank you.
I think so. Hope so.
Yeah, it was. From Larry, has anyone ever considered to install sump pumps in a cistern well outside the home instead of putting the water into footing tile and then bringing the water into the basement?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, it sounds like it may very well be a good idea, but it's not one I've heard. I've never heard of anybody doing it. Put it that way.
Okay, thank you. And when you're not certain about the answer, Blair, is there somewhere that a person could go to find out that kind of information?
Well, what I would suggest, I've got a pretty good team of a bunch of people who are a lot smarter than I am. I would say direct an email to me. You know, I'm quite happy. I think you have my email. Anybody has any of these outstanding questions or they want more detail, send me an email and I'll find out the answer. And also then, and secondarily would be the Insurance Bureau of Canada. They're pretty good, pretty receptive. I know them all well. And if they don't know, they'll find out who knows the answer.
Okay, thank you. And a question from Keith. What is your opinion of the municipal initiatives for natural resource management and asset assessment, such as the Gibson's model, like the one they use out west?
Yeah, so we've written extensively about this, and really what it's an area that's very, very popular right now, and it's basically focuses on retaining natural infrastructure to mitigate flood risk. And in other words, ways to retain to minimize flood risk. Shouldn't always be dependent on building large concrete structures or some sort of built structures to direct water to a safe location or store it safely. That a lot of times nature can provide that same service for a lot less money, and then you get nature in as part of the bonus. So one of the things we're doing right now is we're engaged in an activity to have natural infrastructure actually realized and recognized as a natural asset for communities, that they can actually, for accounting purposes, it can be realized as an asset, which right now it is not. So a lot of work is being developed in the country at the moment to retain the natural infrastructure we have and restore the natural infrastructure we've lost as a flood risk mitigation mechanism, while also supporting biodiversity through natural infrastructure and pollution prevention and maintaining aesthetics, and offering a source of carbon capture and sequestration. This is all a work in progress, and that's drawing a lot of attention. But and it's an area that our organization's going to become deeply involved in promoting over the next couple of years.
Thank you. Now there's a few more questions, but may I interject with a question of my own?
Sure.
In the midst of all of the COVID kinds of news that we hear every day, there was just the smallest little announcement not very long ago that the provincial government was going to pave over the wetlands in a particular area and build a mega warehouse on it, which nobody knew about. So my concern, and we were just talking about wetlands here, how do we find out that kind of information before the decisions are made? Because paving over a wetland will also affect floodplains and flooding and loss of natural land.
Yeah, so there have been elements of this happening in Ontario through something called municipal zoning orders. In other words, it's up to the discretion of the particular minister, in this case housing, can override the conservation authorities in reference to their direction to maintain wetlands. But the government can supersede that, if you will, by saying that for the greater good of the economy are the reasons that are in the best interests of the constituents, that in this case, they could pave over a wetland. So now, how your question is, how would we know about that? It's hopefully, you know, if politicians don't make it known and communicate that information, one of the best things to do would be to vote them out during the next election. I mean, you know, it is their job to inform their constituency of major actions that they are engaging that the constituents would want to be aware of. So it's through various NGOs, non-governmental organizations, those with a you know, natural infrastructure bent, the World Wildlife Fund and conservation authorities and groups like this. Hopefully they're on top of these files and watching what these people are doing fairly carefully, and then communicating that to the public and putting the counter pressure on politicians that might lean in the direction of negating the wetlands and saying, let's give this a rethink. But it's a tough haul, because I think the example you're talking about probably references Pickering and
Amazon, yes.
And the idea there was that with the mayor and some of the councillors, they said, look, at right now with COVID, we've been so negatively hit economically that, quite frankly, nature is going to take a back seat. And if we can pave over this wetland and put this industrial complex in there, employ a couple of thousand people who can now pay mortgages that might otherwise not be able to do so, from our perspective, that's the greater good. So that's one of the things that, quite frankly, we're going to have to reconcile with in Ontario going forward, more and more of those situations, because right now the population of Southern Ontario or not Southern, just the Greater Toronto area is growing by about 70 to 90,000 people per year, period. There's going to be another 1.2 to 1.5 million people in this area by 2030-35, and we're going to see these situations repeat themselves over and over and over again. And I think one of the problems is we haven't really clearly thought out, how do we want to define the Southern Ontario base or the Greater Toronto area going forward? You know, how are we going to reconcile that increase in population with trying to retain natural infrastructure? And the two, in my opinion, to a large degree, are mutually exclusive. So we have to think about the distribution of people in the province and where they go and where do we build infrastructure going forward. And quite frankly, I don't think we can all sit just in the little area band around Lake Ontario.
This next question, thank you, Blair. This next question is related in a similar way. How about from Dana? How about the problems caused by huge new houses with deep basements being built that totally disturb the water flow and drainage of nearby houses? What do city building permits, what do city permits allow this to happen? Why do city permits allow it to happen?
Yeah, and it depends on the municipality, and some are more aggressive for certain conservation authorities on limiting these developments than others. But I would say it is still, to a large extent, in the embryonic stages for most conservation authorities and or municipalities to look at the footprint of homes and basements and calculate the impacts that those developments may have on otherwise the natural flow of water and impede it. We're still at elementary levels of understanding of how the dynamic of water flow is going to be changed or affected through these developments, and we've got to get better at this rapidly. And you can see the consequences of this are starting to manifest themselves more and more. For example, in Oakville right now, and I'm not judging it one way or the other, but there is a class action lawsuit underway whereby based on representation from several thousand homeowners, they're suing the town of Oakville. They've named the mayor as a defendant. I'm not saying they're justified. I'm just saying this is occurring. The town of Oakville, the mayor, I think town council and the conservation authority, and I may not have all of those particularly correct, but through a class action lawsuit for allowing houses to be built in areas that are flood prone. And now these people are finding out that, gee, even if I go to put in a garage on my property or put in a pool, I'm finding out that I'm not allowed to because I'm on a floodplain, and that could further exacerbate flood risk in the area. But also these people are saying, why were houses allowed to be built in those areas in the first place? And then we were allowed to purchase them without knowledge of flood risk. And was that taken into account? So more and more, as driven through a lot of the early slides that I showed you where the costs are just going up associated with flood risk. In the past, we got away with this stuff. We tried to cheat the system, and for a period of time when the density of people in Southern Ontario was low, we got away with it and the problems weren't too dire. But now when we're packing more and more people into the system and building more and more into areas that we shouldn't be in, the problems of cheating the system are showing themselves.
Thank you. Roy is asking a question, and I'll let everybody know. And I did say at the beginning that we're recording this, so anybody that wants to have access to the recording. But Roy wants to know, is this available as a TED Talk?
From my perspective,
Do you do TED Talk?
You can communicate it any way you want. And I have TED Talks that are out there on this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's what he's wondering. Do you have TED Talks? Yeah.
Yeah. And there's like a 10-minute version of this.
Okay. And this is going to go up on YouTube, so everybody can, I'll find out how Don's going to do that, what the name's going to be, but it will go up on YouTube. From Moira, will there be a government incentive programs to support these climate change needs?
Well, they are evolving now. The problem are their incentive programs. They are being developed. The problem is they're developing too slow. And really the way I describe it is that the rate of challenge on the climate file, and particularly the expression of extreme weather risk, is on this slope. Our ability to keep up is on this slope, and the dispersion between these two lines is increasing over time. So it's, so we've got to move more quickly on the file of preparedness. The number one thing that we can do to get the most risk out of the system, save the most money over the shortest period of time relative to the expression of extreme weather risk, for sure in Canada, by far, is to launch a national home flood protection education program. In other words, the stuff I just talked about, to make that information available to homeowners to help them protect their properties from basement flooding. That should be the first item on the agenda, because it's the easiest thing to do to save the most amount of money, to take the most disruption out of people's lives that otherwise will be realized going forward. That's a simple thing to do. And my view is, if we can't do that, how are we possibly going to solve all these other problems that are far more complex in nature? So if we can't solve the simple problems, what are we going to do with the complex ones? And one of the problems in Canada, and these are my friends, ministers, deputy ministers, and so forth, they're fine people in government, is that one of the big problems is we are very good at developing strategy and policy. We're policy rich, we're strategy rich, but we're operations poor. We've got to take the stuff and actually operationalize it. And therein lies the problem. For those reports I showed you earlier, that we have scores and scores of very smart people contributing to, that come up with practical, meaningful, cost-effective ways to solve problems. We put it out in a report, we do a press release, we do a couple of dozen interviews in the media and so forth. That's all great. But most people stop at that point and go, well, I've done my job. No, at least for our group, we now consider we've done the first 15% of the work. The remaining 85% is staying on that direction like a dog on a bone, and you've got to take it and you've got to drive it to turn it into on the ground action. And that is the hard part. And that's what most people are not willing to do.
Thank you. And sometimes perhaps don't know what to do.
Yes, but even when they know what to do, they still won't. And I don't mean everybody. I mean, there's a lot of people.
No.
And the other thing to be careful about, to be, in my opinion, should send up red flags or whatever the word is when people start talking about, where we're going to be in 2050 and 2080 and so forth. That's all good. And I like that visionary. I mean, I think about this stuff all the time. But quite frankly, I'm also worried about where are we going to be in 2 weekends from now? I want to know, for example, people on this call, if they own a home, are they going to go out and actually examine their basement for flooding and operationalize those measures we just talked about? There's a tangible thing to do. Will that actually happen? Some percentage of people will and other people won't, and they'll wait for the disaster to occur. That's the way it is. So how do we motivate people to help themselves? That's the trick.
Thank you, Blair. A couple more questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Rita, should the building code contain to help protect natural infrastructure, especially when developers come in and seem driven to pave over as much square footage as possible?
Well, yeah, by the way, Rita asks good questions. Whoever Rita is, she's smart. And, but basically right now, the rule of thumb in terms of retaining natural infrastructure within the context of new community development is to try and save about 30% of the natural infrastructure to incorporate that into new residential community design. Would we like more? The answer is yes, but I think the working number that everybody can agree upon and is willing to accept is about 30%. And I work a great deal with the Ontario Biodiversity Council. They're good friends of ours, and they can live with the 30% number. Would they like more? The answer is yes, but they can live with 30%, but they can't live with 10%. But even there, it's not so simple to say, but what does that actually mean? So if we built a community that was just like, say, 1 kilometer square, do we build it 1 kilometer square with an extra 30% tacked onto the side and then say, well, that's really what we were after. Therefore, we've got our 30% retained because that's within this overall footprint. We've got to make it so that it's not disingenuous the way we incorporate the 30% into the new community design. Now, having said that, I'm also working right now with a major builder who really, a major developer who wants to do the right thing in terms of building a new community that takes into account, among other points, flood risk mitigation and retains natural infrastructure. But one of the things that the developer is telling me is that when they actually go out and try and incorporate these features into that new community design, pushing the envelope in a positive direction, they encounter all kinds of counter bureaucracy that prevents them from doing it, from getting their development done. So by doing the right thing, they end up with more bureaucratic rules limiting their ability to get the community built. So it's in other words, the incentive is working backwards. And by the way, I'm not making this stuff up. I mean, this is the way it is.
Right. And one last question, and then we'll stop the questions. The 30% number is not respected in this infill situations in Toronto, neither in residential nor institutional buildings.
Yes, the answer is yes. So we, and do we have a ways to go? The answer, I can give you a long string of limitations that should be addressed that simply aren't being addressed. And I agree. So, that's where we're pushing the envelope as much as we can all the time, relentlessly, basically.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for being willing to come and take part in this evening. And Blair, I can't thank you enough for your presentation. I understood it, so that's really, really good. I need to thank Don McCauley for his technical assistance. As always, he does such a great job. But Blair, your knowledge, your thoughtfulness, your time, your ability to answer the questions, we just can't thank you enough for being able to do this for us this evening. I never did introduce myself. I am Reverend Deborah Miguel, and I'm the minister here at St. Stephen's on the Hill United Church. And I want to end tonight blessing all of you. And before we go, Blair, can I put your email into the chat?
Yes, absolutely.
Would you like to give it to me? Hang on. All right.
B, Feltmate, so BFELTMATE
Yeah.
at U, like the letter U,
University.
Waterloo.ca, uwaterloo.ca. And if
B
I can't
Feltmate.
answer if anybody asks me a question that if I can't answer it, I'll find out who can answer it.
Okay, and I'll just make sure that this is going to everybody and not just one person. All right.
But,
So
and for sure, by the way, communicate that infographic, that one page that people can download as well. That's on our website.
okay, so B Feltmate at uwaterloo.ca.
Correct.
All right, I just sent that to everyone. And again, everyone, for your questions, for your staying with us through the presentation. And I hope that you found it not just interesting, but really helpful. So I do want to send you out with a blessing. Mahatma Gandhi said these words, and I'm sure everybody knows them: be the change you want to see in the world. So my dear people, as you go back out now into the world, may the Spirit of God that blows like the wind, the power of Christ that calms the raging storms, and the wisdom of God displayed in all of creation fill you with strength and courage to see and hear with God's eyes and ears. So go out then into God's world and be the change needed to help heal this bruised and hurting world. Go in peace that it might be so. Amen. And if you want to unmute yourself for a minute and say anything to anybody, by all means, go ahead. And Blair, there's thanks for you in the chat from people.
Very good. Thank you. I appreciate very much. And Deborah, thank you for all your efforts.
You're very, very welcome.